All right, we are back here on the podcast, getting ready for another NBA season. Knicks are coming off a successful year. They won 47 games last year, get to the second round of the Eastern Conference playoffs. Join me today to get ready for the next season here. We a contributor for Knicks Film Skool, NBA guy, DJ Ace is here. DJ, how are you?
I'm good. Mike, how are you?
Doing good.
Can't, can't wait for the NBA to get going. It's been a long off season, but happy to get some real games to break down.
Yeah, for sure here. It feels weird that considering the state of the baseball, the football here, the Knicks might be like the saving grace in New York sports in 2023.
Little stability there out of MSG, which is shocking, but it's true. There's we can talk more about it as we move along, but there's the fact that they're bringing back a close to the same roster as last year, and there's a pretty high floor at this team. Ceiling is to be determined, but yeah, there's some you can kind of fall back on your Knicks fandom a little bit and say at least we got them to fall, in terms of just winning some games and getting to the playoffs and having some good moments at MSG. I think you're a pretty good idea that that's going to happen.
Yeah, for sure here. And start with that offseason here, because obviously we saw a lot of big moves in the NBA. We saw Damian Lillard go to Milwaukee. We saw Drew Holiday go to the Bucks, all the Kristaps Porzingis, Marcus Smart shipped out. They kind of do the opposite, where they kind of go, okay, making one swap. We're bringing in Donte DiVincenzo. We're trading Obi Toppin. They keep the group together here. Like, you feel like that was the right way for them to attack the offseason?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I feel like stepping back, they clearly know that they are a move away, at least one major move from really being a title contender. And I think if they had their druthers, they would make a trade if it was for that right superstar. But I think they're being rightfully so very picky in terms of who that is going to be. I think they probably had opportunities, whether it was Bradley Beal before the offseason really got going, or other players of that ilk. Paul George was rumored earlier in the offseason. I think they probably could make a trade if they really wanted to. They certainly have the assets. I just think they're waiting on the right guy. And now the question is whether that guy ever presents itself and if they can actually pull the trigger on that trade. That's something the front office is going to have to answer. But I think the fact that, they are bringing back close to the same roster with a relatively minor change, I think is going to give them a little bit of an edge, at least early on in the regular season, as teams start to figure things out. This has been a good regular season team 2 out of the 3 years under Tom Thibodeau. I wouldn't really expect anything different when they get to the playoffs. And there's going to be some major question marks regarding how this team can level up as they get there. But in terms of the regular season, the fact that they are bringing back this close to the same roster with a full year out of Josh Hart, I think it's going to really bear some positive fruit for them going into the season.
Yeah, definitely excited to see that here. One thing I don't think it's talked about enough here, I think it's fascinating in terms of the international experience some of the key players the Knicks got in the FIBA World Cup in the offseason. I mean, you got Jalen Brunson and Josh Hart on Team USA, RJ Barrett's on Team Canada. Like, we've seen in the past that international experience tends to bring up the game of some of these guys who go out and do it. That's a benefit for the Knicks.
Yeah, I think so. Especially, I think a lot of it is, certainly game action is hugely important, but it's almost like if I feel like the camaraderie and the practice, the one-on-ones that you get against some of the best players when you're just kind of hanging out in a gym and you're playing one-on-one against some of the best players in the world. I think that goes a long way. And just, these guys are highly confident, but I think it could sort of like just make it a little more indelible that you are one of the best players in the world. So I think for Josh Hart and for Jalen Brunson, I think that was a big key. And then for RJ Barrett, I think for Team Canada, his role was vastly different. He was more of a play finisher for them. He was great in transition and actually played really well on the defensive end. So in terms of him specifically, I think there were some things that he did in terms of his efficiency and his shooting, which we can get into a little bit, but he really revamped his shooting form this year. And as a catch and shoot guy during the the FIBA World Cup, he really shot the ball pretty well, and couple that with his transition opportunities that he had with Canada. I think that's sort of a player the Knicks are going to need as being, potentially the third banana on a really good team, where he's going to finish in transition and make open shots. I think if he does those two things and just play competent defense, I think that's going to be a big opportunity for them to level up without making a big change in the offseason.
Yeah, that's for sure here. And obviously the one big acquisition here is Donte DiVincenzo, brings in some shooting here. He's another Villanova connection here. Hard-nosed guard who Tom Thibodeau's going to love in his rotation here. What do you think Donte DiVincenzo adds to this roster?
So he has some variability in the way he plays the game. He's a great cutter. He's a good mover off the ball. He's sometimes could be a little bit turnover prone, but he's a really good passer. I think he does some things that the Knicks lack in terms of just his awareness on the offensive and defensive end. He's going to be, the Knicks are blessed with some really good high level defensive players, but they don't really have a guy that can be that ball hawk, free safety type player that can make steals and turn that into offense in the other end. DiVincenzo really does that in terms of the defensive side of the ball. And then offensively, you mentioned the shooting. It's not only just the fact that he can make shots at a high clip, it's the fact that he is going to be their best spacer in terms of the depth he can get on those shots. I looked at it last year. He had one of the highest average in terms of 3-point distance in the NBA. He was right up there with some of the great shooters in the league. So the fact that he can space out 3 feet behind the 3-point line adds to the spacing. And then, of course, last year at least he was a knockdown shooter. So hopefully he can carry that over into the season. But that combined with the cutting and his movement and the way he sees the game, I think he just is going to be a value add. And, certainly there's going to be a crunch with the minutes. There's probably 9 or 10 guys that deserve minutes. How many are actually going to get, significant minutes on this team is going to be something we're going to have to watch out for. But he does add some dexterity to his game offensively that the team really lacks. They have some good isolation players, and RJ has been a good play finisher transition wise. But I think in terms of just moving and adding a little bit of variability to their offense, I think DiVincenzo really is going to bring that element to the game.
Yeah, it's exciting to watch for sure here. And it was something in terms of the shooting. I thought we were going to have Evan Fournier, who fell out of the rotation last year. And obviously, being in the summer, he's like, I don't think I'm going to be here next year.
Right.
I'm on a roll here. Fast forward to opening day, he's still here. So are you surprised that he's still hung around, that they didn't move him at this point?
A little bit. Yep. I think that they're probably valuing his contract with the new CBA as a contract they're not willing to attach assets to get rid of. I think they're probably viewing that contract as almost a net positive because of the fact that it's expiring after the season. So I think they're not willing to, if there's one thing this front office is really, kind of honed in on, they try to get every edge, every little, if they can get an extra penny or two in a trade, they're going to do it. They know that those things add up over time. So I think it's one of those things where they're banking on the fact that even though he's made some comments suggesting that he can certainly play, and he certainly has some evidence backing him up, but I think they're going to bank on the fact that he's going to be professional. And if there's an injury or two, he can play in a game in an NBA and make shots. I mean, that's something he can still do. He's proven it time and time again. Obviously, there's some warts to his game that got him out of the rotation originally, but not a bad guy you want around. I think they're just waiting on the fact that, they can probably trade him and either, combine him with another salary for a big trade, because it's all about accumulating those salary numbers on the lower end to get the bigger guys. So, yeah, a little surprised that he wasn't moved, but I just think the front office is not willing to attach assets to get rid of him. And that's probably the biggest reason why he's still here.
Yeah. And one guy who was in trade rumors last year, wasn't as much this summer as RJ Barrett. We talked about moving earlier with his international series with Canada here. He took his game up another level in the playoffs last year. Yes, sir. Round series against Miami. So you feel like we've seen enough between the playoffs, the international experience, where you expect RJ to sort of make a jump here where he's, maybe contending for a spot on the All-Star team, everything breaks right?
Yeah, so I've probably been a little bit lower than consensus on RJ since they drafted him, and I don't necessarily think that there's a likely all-star ceiling. Now, if everything breaks right, sure, I think he can probably get there. Now, there's going to be the issue of he's going to be the third option unless there's an injury. So will he accumulate the numbers to really contend for an all-star spot? I'm skeptical in that regard, but with all that being said, you need guys like him, and the Knicks they really don't have a lot of those 6'7", 6'8" wing players that are strong and that can get to the rim. They have a lot of the 6'4", 6'5" and under, so they certainly need his size and his strength. And there were a certain there were some things offensively that he did in terms of the way he was processing the game as a passer in the playoffs that I'm really hoping carries over. And in the preseason, I know you don't take too much away from it, but making those reads out of the pick and roll and hitting shooters on the opposite corner. And those are the things that if he can start doing those things and sort of taking out those bad, inefficient attempts at the rim, that'll not only boost his efficiency to take those shots out of his shot diet, but also benefit his teammates by finding those shooters outside on the perimeter. And then just looking at some tape today, there was at least 3 or 4 times where he's grabbing the ball on defense, on the defensive rebounding, and then he's going and he's finding shooters in that situation too. So I think the passing is probably the biggest thing that I can see as a big jump for him. And if he improves his passing, get that efficiency up to maybe league average, then you're talking about a guy that's a really good player, third, fourth option on a really good team, which is still, a valuable piece to have on your roster, even if it's maybe not quite an all-star.
Yeah, that's for sure here. Definitely valuable here. And one guy who's probably been there most valuable player the last like 4 or 5 years has been Julius Randle here. And he's had his ups and downs where he's made all NBA teams a couple of times. He had the vanishing act in the playoffs against Atlanta 2 years ago. Last year he's playing with the ankle injury and he looks like insecure in his shot attempts here. So like if should the Knicks have be any concern about like Randle? We know what he delivers in the regular season. The fact in the playoffs that he's sort of gone like shrinking violet the last two playoff appearances for them.
Yeah, it'll be a concern until it's not. And certainly, as you alluded, his regular season 2 out of the last 3 years has been fantastic. I mean, 2 of the best Knicks season individually speaking that they've ever had in their franchise. So he is a big time offensive player in the regular season. Now I think that we've gotten to the point where we are underrating that fact that he is really, despite the ankle injury last year, he's very durable. He's performed well in the regular season. He's going to help this team get into the playoffs, in my opinion. Now, when he gets there, he has a lot of questions to answer. And I think that, you mentioned the ankle injury. Despite, putting that aside, I think there were some things in the way he processes the game that just leave a lot to be desired. I don't think you're necessarily changing that. He doesn't see things very quickly, even though he commands a lot of attention. He doesn't really make the defense pay as much as you would like because he's a beat behind sometimes, and he can allow those rotations to sort of get balanced because he's not seeing that pass quick enough. But the fact remains that they just need him, and they need him to play 75 plus games in the regular season because there's just not a lot in terms of, he just levels his team up offensively. So when they get to the playoffs, if he could just make more shots, catch and shoot, and just be a little bit better on the defensive end, that's probably going to be, it's definitely gonna be a big improvement. It might be good enough to get this team potentially into the Eastern Conference Finals if he has a really great postseason. But, there's some things, the way he sees the game, the way he processes it, where at 28, 29 years old, I don't necessarily bank on that changing, but there's some other low hanging fruit just in terms of shot making, taking better shots that he can probably improve on in the playoffs. And that should allow him to have a better outcome.
Yeah, that's for sure here. And obviously, the one big question in the rotation, in my opinion, is just obviously we all know that Obi Toppin is gone. They send to Indiana for the 2 second-round picks here. There's a big hole with backup power forward because Julius the only one really on a guaranteed contract on the roster here. I know they've experimented with different things in the second unit. They had Josh Hart running as the 4 on that unit. They've had our RJ in the mix as well. They've thought maybe doing Jericho Sims as sort of like a dual big format here. Like, how do you think they attack that backup 4 spot?
Yeah, I think that you're going to see a lot of Josh Hart. I think he's going to get the primary backup 4 minutes. I think RJ is certainly going to get a look at that. And they really, as you mentioned, they really did at least get a look at Jericho Sims at the 4. I think the minutes there were in the preseason a bit spotty because I just think there's a spacing issue that you're just it's just going to be hard for you to figure out. Now, with that being said, we're really banking on the 75. I mentioned 75 games out of Julius Randle, and I think there's a little bit of the idea that you're going to get that this year, and I think that this team is going to be in a little bit of a trouble if he's not performing that well, because if you're not performing that many games. So I looked at Josh Hart, he played some 4 for FIBA, and there's just times where, as hard as he plays, as aggressive as he is, as good a rebounder as he is, 6'4", and if you're going up against 6'8" plus power forwards, it's just tough for him. I think he's at his best when he can crash from the perimeter and really get those offensive rebounds, those back-breaking offensive rebounds that he's so accustomed to getting. I think it's much harder for him when he's having to contend with guys that are 4 or 5 inches taller than him. So it's definitely a question mark. I don't, because of the way Obi Toppin played, I don't necessarily think that they're going to, I think they're probably gaining a little bit in the rebounding department. But there's probably a little bit more weak side rim protection that Obi can offer just by sheer length and athleticism that they're not going to be able to replace unless you're going to go with a Jericho Sims lineup. And then that is one where, teams are really going to, shade again off his side. And if they're going to put him at the corner, he's going to have the ball in his hands. And then that's him, catching maybe a lot more DHO action with him with the ball diving to the rim, but they're going to have to figure out some way to hide him a bit. But we know Thibodeau, he's going to have his center. He's going to have Hartenstein or Mitch in that at the spot next to Jericho. So maybe it's going to be more of the Hartenstein Sims minutes because, while I don't think Hartenstein is a stretch big by any stretch of the imagination, he has a floater game that's pretty efficient. And the fact that he can catch the ball out on the perimeter and do something with it, put the ball on the floor, maybe go get all the way to the rim. So I think you can maybe theorize that a Hartenstein Sims pairing at the 5-4 in spurts can work depending on the matchup. So certainly a big question going into this season, but I think they're probably going to be okay with Hart, RJ, and in spot duty, Jericho.
Yeah, that's for sure here. And one of the players who's interesting here, I want to sort of touch on real because we're recording on extension deadline day in the NBA, and less than an hour from the deadline, they've Knicks not reached a long-term extension with Isaiah Emmanuel quickly yet, which I mean, not a big deal because obviously they still have his rights. He can go to restricted free agency after this year. But are you surprised that it's in this that they have not put to come to terms as of recording time?
Yeah, I am. Now I don't. Obviously, we're not privy to the negotiation, so we don't know what the Quickly side is putting forth as what they're willing to accept, because I'm sure he is seeing some of the deals that are being signed, whether it's Devin Vassell or Jaden McDaniels, who signed earlier today while we were recording to a massive deal. So he's seeing these contracts, and if you're analytically sound, and I'm sure the Quickly side is has these numbers. Analytically, he's as good as, there's probably, you can argue he's one of the top 25 players in the league. If you're strictly looking at those numbers, he has a great case for that. He probably should have won Sixth Man of the Year last year. So I think that there's clearly a sizable gap between what the Knicks are willing to do and what Quickly's team is willing to accept. Now, the question, the issue that for the Knicks is that if you don't sign him, and he goes to restricted free agency, we know there's going to be a handful of teams that should have a max slot, if not more, that probably would be willing to throw a major offer at Quickly. So to get into restricted free agency, that's dicey. So, if I'm as a Knicks supporter, I would like to see them come to a deal, but, without having, and I'm sure we'll get reporting if we get to deadline and there is no deal signed. I'm sure we'll get reporting in terms of where the gap was and how sizable it really was. But Quickly side, he views himself as a starting point guard in the NBA. As long as Jalen Brunson is here, he doesn't have that spot on the Knicks. So this could be a case where the Knicks are viewing him as maybe a sixth starter. Certainly good enough to start, but just doesn't have that spot on this roster. And I'm sure they're offering, a contract that is, commensurate with what they feel he is. But if Quickly is like, listen, I am a burgeoning all-star, I should be a starting point guard. And this is what starting point guards in the NBA are getting. And that's, 4 or 5 years, upwards of $120 million. Then, we could be getting past the deadline with no contract signed, which is just going to add a lot of question marks, going into that offseason.
Yeah, for sure here. And obviously he's one of the pieces keeping an eye on here because obviously the Knicks have been amassing these chips, whether it's draft picks, young players, looking for the eventual star trade. We mentioned before, Leon Rose is very, very patient, looking for the right guy. It's like, how much longer, how patient do you think he is willing to be in this scenario? Because obviously they passed on opportunities, potentially be in the Damian Lillard sweepstakes, Holiday, Bradley Beal, several other guys you mentioned before here. Like, do you feel like they have one specific guy they're looking for, archetype, or this? You think that they might get some point in page and say, we have to make our move now. Here's the next available guy. We'll get him.
It's a great question. Last year, clearly they were in on the Donovan Mitchell sweepstakes. Now that was prior to the Jalen Brunson leap. And I'm sure I know the Knicks didn't expect the performance that Brunson had last year when they were in those negotiations with Utah. I can't imagine they were. Now, Donovan Mitchell, he could be the fallback guy because it's clear that he hasn't re-signed with Cleveland. He's not extending there. He wants to be in New York, and whether that's with the Knicks or Brooklyn, that's actually a pretty viable question here. But he could be your backup plan. But in terms of the marquee guy, it has to be Embiid. I just think that obviously there's the CAA connections. But it's more than just than that. It's the fit. I think if there's one guy that's potentially attainable that can, he's not the perfect superstar. There's certainly the injuries and the playoff performances that have been, he just hasn't been as good in the playoffs as he has been in the regular season. but I think he's a guy you can talk yourself into in terms of putting you over the top. And I think that, he is at least someone that legitimately could be had because of all the different question marks that Philadelphia is currently going through. At his age, I don't think he is going to be interested in a rebuild, or even if it's a 1-year rebuild. I don't think he's necessarily going to be into the idea of just let's wait a year and then go free agency in a max slot next year. So I think that he could be a guy that can demand his way out. And I think the Knicks are probably keeping their powder dry for him. And then beyond that, I do, let's just say the Clippers don't end up getting James Harden. And yes, they have a new arena that they are going to have to sell tickets for. But I do wonder if Paul George and Kawhi Leonard are going to be available come to the trade deadline, or maybe this coming off season if they don't have a great season. And I think both of those guys, major concerns on both of them. They're going to want extensions. They're getting up there in age. There's the injury issues, but I think both of them represent the sort of wing defender two-way player that this team doesn't have currently. So I think that they would both potentially be great fits on this roster, but I think it's all going to come down to Embiid. So as you're, paying attention to, your Knicks, I think paying attention to what's going on in Philadelphia is going to be just as important. Because if he's not happy and he's going to want out, we know he's going to want to go to, a handful of teams. And I'm pretty confident the Knicks will be on that list. And it's just a matter of do they have the assets to make that happen?
Yeah, for sure. And obviously that's a far way away here. Let's take a look at the current roster. Here's the last question I sort of have for you here. Is obviously they had a lot of things go right last year. They get to the second round, they give the Heat a run and end up losing 6 games here. Do you think that that's sort of their ceiling with this group? You think that there's room where they can make another step if you have some internal improvement for younger guys like RJ and Quickly and Quentin Grimes and so on?
Yeah, before the season started, I thought that this team had a ceiling to get to the Eastern Finals, and it just that was before the Lillard trade, and then Boston getting Porzingis and then Holiday. So I really think that if I had to be fair about this, I think second round is a reasonable ceiling for this roster, bearing any moves that add some talent injection to this roster, because I just think that Milwaukee and Boston, they're so good right now. I think Boston you can argue in terms of 1 through 6 is as good as it's been potentially since the Durant Warriors in terms of talent. I think they're a great team. And I think the Lillard, Giannis pairing is going to be just fantastic. And if Giannis is healthy, and you get another, great year out of Lopez, and you have obviously Portis and the guys they have surrounding them, I think that they have every right to feel that they are a title contender. And I just think that before they got those trades happen, I thought the Knicks, if everything broke right, another leap by, as you mentioned, RJ and maybe Brunson getting even a little bit better, you can probably talk yourself into getting to the Eastern Finals. And as you mentioned, they did take the Heat to 6 games, who, ended up going to the finals. So, but after these trades, I think a fair ceiling is second round. But I think what that does is continue this idea that this is a good organization, a good team that is still a player away. And I think that there's going to be a player that's going to want to come here. And if they can continue just moving the ball, down the field, so to speak, and winning in the upwards of 47, 48 games and winning around the playoffs, I think there's still going to be a team that is going to have some interest around the league if players, if it's when they ask out. I think the Knicks will be on many of those lists, and they certainly have the assets, and it'll be up to Leon Rose and company to sort of decide, when to strike and how aggressive to be when you do strike. So, yeah, I think that, second round is a fair ceiling, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think, keeping this thing moving in a positive direction is probably a decent outcome for this organization.
Yeah, certainly, for sure, DJ. Thanks for all the time. I really appreciate it. If you want to follow your NBA coverage, how can they do that? Follow you on social media.
Yeah, DJ Ace NBA on Twitter. You can see all my stuff there. So if I'm doing other things around there, or on X, it's gonna take a while for me to get used to calling Twitter X, but on either one, whatever you call it, on that platform, DJ Ace NBA, you'll see all my stuff there, all my work with Knicks Film Skool. You can find all my work there. So yeah, thanks for having me on, and let's go Knicks. Hopefully have a good season to sort of break down, and maybe I'll come on and we can talk about some actual games down the line.